The definition of kitchen in the National Electrical Code, or NEC, is an area used for the preparation of food and that contains a stove, oven, range, cooktop, or other permanently installed cooking appliance. Serving lines typically do not meet this definition as they are used for assembling and distributing food, not cooking it. Therefore, the serving area is not typically considered part of the kitchen under the NEC. The NEC requires GFCI protection for all 120-volt receptacles in wet or damp locations, such as kitchens. GFCIs are intended to protect people from electrical shocks in areas where water is present or likely to be present. Receptacles used for computers, cash registers, and other electronic equipment are generally not considered to be in wet or damp locations and are therefore not required to be GFCI protected. The inspector is interpreting the code to include the serving area as part of the kitchen and, therefore, requiring all 120-volt receptacles in that area to be GFCI protected. This interpretation may not be consistent with the NEC definition of kitchen. Firstly, discuss it with the inspector. Explain the NEC definition of kitchen and argue that the serving area does not qualify as such. Provide examples of similar installations that have been accepted without GFCIs in the serving area. Secondly, contact the authority having jurisdiction, or urge, if the inspector is unwilling to compromise, and consider contacting the authority having jurisdiction for a second opinion. The AHA can provide an official interpretation of the code. Thirdly, install GFCIs if all else fails. You may have to install GFCIs in the non-isolated ground receptacles in the serving area to comply with the inspector's request. However, consider labeling these receptacles as GFCI protected for convenience to indicate that they are not required by code. It's important to note that different jurisdictions may have their own interpretations of the NEC. Consulting with a licensed electrician can help ensure that the electrical installation is compliant with all applicable codes and standards. Consider the specific requirements outlined in the NEC regarding GFCI protection. Article 210.8 details the requirements for GFCI protection in dwelling units and other locations. While the specific requirements for commercial kitchens may not be explicitly defined in the same way as for dwelling units, the general principles of GFCI protection in wet or damp locations apply. Pay attention to the specific language used in the NEC to determine whether the serving area meets the criteria for requiring GFCI protection. Also consider the purpose of isolated ground receptacles. Isolated ground receptacles are designed to reduce electrical noise and interference in sensitive electronic equipment. They provide a separate grounding path for the equipment, which helps to prevent noise from other sources from interfering with its operation. Installing GFCIs on isolated ground receptacles may defeat the purpose of the isolated ground, as the GFCI may introduce additional noise into the grounding system. In addition, consider the potential for nuisance tripping of GFCIs. GFCIs are designed to trip when they detect a ground fault, which is an unintended path for electricity to flow to ground. In some cases, electronic equipment may generate small amounts of leakage current that can cause GFCIs to trip unnecessarily. This can be a nuisance in a commercial kitchen, where equipment needs to be running continuously. Therefore, it's important to carefully consider the potential for nuisance tripping before installing GFCIs on receptacles that serve electronic equipment. Be aware of any local amendments to the NEC. Local jurisdictions may have their own amendments to the NEC that modify or add to the requirements for GFCI protection. It's important to check with the local building department to determine whether there are any local amendments that apply to the serving area. If there are local amendments, they may supersede the requirements in the NEC. Also consider the possibility of using an exception to the GFCI requirements. The NEC allows for exceptions to the GFCI requirements in certain situations. For example, an exception may be allowed if the receptacles are used exclusively for equipment that is not easily portable and is unlikely to be used in a wet or damp location. If the receptacles in the serving area meet the criteria for an exception, you may be able to avoid the requirement for GFCI protection. Consider consulting with an electrical engineer. An electrical engineer can provide expert advice on the GFCI requirements for the serving area. They can review the plans for the electrical installation and determine whether the receptacles meet the requirements for GFCI protection. They can also provide recommendations on how to comply with the code in the most cost-effective way. Furthermore, document your efforts to comply with the code. Keep records of all communications with the inspector and the AHJ. Also, keep records of any research you have done on the GFCI requirements. This documentation will be helpful if you need to appeal the inspector's decision. Keep in mind the serving area layout. Analyze the layout of the serving area to determine whether it meets the definition of a kitchen. Consider factors such as the presence of cooking appliances, sinks, and other sources of water. If the serving area does not contain any of these features, it may be possible to argue that it is not a kitchen and therefore does not require GFCI protection. Review the electrical plans. Review the electrical plans for the restaurant to determine whether the receptacles in the serving area are designated as GFCI protected. If the plans do not specify GFCI protection, it may be possible to argue that the inspector is requiring something that was not originally intended. Communicate with the restaurant owner. Keep the restaurant owner informed of the situation and explain the potential costs of complying with the inspector's request. The owner may be willing to negotiate with the inspector or the AHJ to find a compromise solution. Consider using a GFCI receptacle with an isolated ground. Some manufacturers offer GFCI receptacles that also provide an isolated ground. These receptacles can provide both GFCI protection and noise reduction for sensitive electronic equipment. However, they may be more expensive than standard GFCI receptacles. Evaluate the risk of electrical shock in the serving area. Consider the potential for water to be present in the serving area. If there is a low risk of water exposure, it may be possible to argue that GFCI protection is not necessary. Consider the types of equipment that will be used in the serving area. If the equipment is double insulated or otherwise protected from electrical shock, it may be possible to argue that GFCI protection is not necessary. Also consider the cost of installing GFCIs. The cost of installing GFCIs can be significant, especially if there are a large number of receptacles in the serving area. Consider the potential for future changes to the electrical code. The NEC is updated every 3 years. It is possible that the requirements for GFCI protection will change in the future. Be aware of these changes so that you can comply with the latest code requirements. Remember that the inspector's interpretation of the code may be based on their own experience and judgment. They may have seen similar installations in the past where GFCI protection was necessary. Try to understand the inspector's perspective and address their concerns. Ultimately, the goal is to ensure the safety of the restaurant's employees and customers. If there is a legitimate concern about electrical shock, it is important to take steps to mitigate the risk. However, it is also important to ensure that the requirements for GFCI protection are applied fairly and consistently. Consider the potential for using a ground fault circuit interrupter circuit breaker instead of GFCI receptacles. A GFCI circuit breaker provides GFCI protection for the entire circuit rather than just the individual receptacles. This may be a more cost-effective solution if there are a large number of receptacles in the serving area. However, it is important to ensure that the GFCI circuit breaker is compatible with the isolated ground receptacles. Consider the potential for using a surge protective device in addition to GFCI protection. Surge protective devices protect electronic equipment from voltage surges, which can damage or destroy the equipment. Surge protective devices are often used in conjunction with GFCI protection to provide comprehensive protection for electronic equipment. Ensure proper grounding. Proper grounding is essential for electrical safety. Make sure that the electrical system is properly grounded and that all equipment is properly grounded. This will help to prevent electrical shock and reduce the risk of nuisance tripping of GFCIs. Stay informed about changes to the NEC. The NEC is constantly evolving. Stay informed about changes to the NEC so that you can comply with the latest code requirements. You can subscribe to industry publications, attend training courses, or consult with a licensed electrician to stay up to date on the latest changes. Remember that the electrical code is intended to protect people from electrical hazards. While it is important to comply with the code, it is also important to use common sense and good judgment. If you have any concerns about electrical safety, consult with a licensed electrician. Consider the specific requirements for isolated ground receptacles in the NEC. The NEC provides specific requirements for the installation of isolated ground receptacles. Make sure that the isolated ground receptacles are installed in accordance with these requirements. This will help to ensure that the isolated ground is effective and that the receptacles are safe to use. Be aware of the potential for electromagnetic interference from other equipment in the serving area. Electromagnetic interference can interfere with the operation of sensitive electronic equipment. Consider using shielded cables and other techniques to reduce electromagnetic interference. Consider the potential for damage to the receptacles from cleaning chemicals. Cleaning chemicals can damage the receptacles and cause them to fail. Use receptacles that are resistant to cleaning chemicals or protect the receptacles from cleaning chemicals. Consider the potential for physical damage to the receptacles from carts and other equipment. Carts and other equipment can damage the receptacles and cause them to fail. Protect the receptacles from physical damage by installing them in a protected location or by using receptacle covers. Consider the potential for tampering with the receptacles. Tampering with the receptacles can create a safety hazard. Use tamper-resistant receptacles or install receptacle covers to prevent tampering. Consider the potential for overloading the receptacles. Overloading the receptacles can cause them to overheat and fail. Make sure that the receptacles are not overloaded. Use a receptacle tester to check the wiring of the receptacles. A receptacle tester can identify common wiring problems such as open grounds and reversed polarity. Correct any wiring problems that are identified. Consider the potential for using a wireless power transfer system instead of receptacles. Wireless power transfer systems can eliminate the need for receptacles altogether. However, wireless power transfer systems are still relatively new and may not be suitable for all applications. Be sure to clearly label all receptacles in the serving area. Labeling the receptacles will help to prevent confusion and ensure that equipment is plugged into the correct receptacles. Consider using a color coding system to identify different types of receptacles. For example, you could use blue receptacles for GFCI protected receptacles and orange receptacles for isolated ground receptacles. Consider the potential for using a smart receptacle system. Smart receptacle systems can provide remote monitoring and control of receptacles. This can be useful for managing energy consumption and preventing equipment failures. Remember that the goal is to provide a safe and reliable electrical system for the restaurant. By carefully considering the requirements for GFCI protection and isolated ground receptacles, you can help to ensure that the electrical system meets the needs of the restaurant and protects its employees and customers. And remember to consult with qualified professionals. Electrical work should always be performed by qualified professionals. Do not attempt to perform electrical work yourself unless you are properly trained and licensed. Ignoring these requirements can lead to unsafe conditions, including the risk of electrical shock and fire.